Hello and welcome to the COVID-19 Live Q&A, the latest in our series of regular events on COVID-related issues on our COVID-19 community platform. Just to note that we'll be recording this Q&A. I'll show the speakers, but please feel free to switch off your cameras and please look to stay on mute unless you want to ask a question. I'm delighted to be joined by Dee Holmes from Relate, the UK's largest provider of relationship support. Dee is a qualified couple, family, children and young persons counsellor and supervisor, and she currently works as part of the clinical management team at Relate. To begin, it'd be great just to find out a bit more about yourself and how you came to be involved with Relate.
Well, it's a long time ago now. 1997, I started my work at Relate. I began as a couple counsellor. I think probably it's true of a lot of counsellors. I had some counselling myself, and then I went on to do a sort of basic counselling skills course, and then at the end of that wondered what to do next. And I must admit, I sort of just was very attracted to the thought of couple counselling, and so that's what drew me to Relate. And then obviously I've gone through that journey of upskilling myself further with family training and young persons and children. So, whilst I guess my basic thing was about relationships, I think that loss and grief and all of that comes into that. Loss can take many forms, and it's often a big part of the work that we're dealing with.
And for those people who aren't so aware, how do Relate help people? And how has the support provided changed since the pandemic began?
So Relate is an organisation that's a national organisation with sort of got centres throughout the country. And until sort of about 5 or 6 years ago, we were totally a federated organisation. So, we had the national body that did the policies and practice, arrangements, and everybody was federated, bought into that, had the same training, followed the same process, but ran their own centre as its own independent charity. In the last few years, about 13 or 14 of our centres have come into what we call national. So national now has a delivery arm. So we are responsible for delivery in some 3 national regions. And then we still have our federated centres in other areas. So to people out there accessing us, you are going to access Relate in the same way. It won't matter to you really whether it's federated or national, but internally it's a slightly different thing. So, we are the relationship people, but we don't just deal with that. So we see people in relationships, we see single people, we see individuals who are dealing with all a range of issues, and young persons, children's and family work is also a big part of what we do. And in some areas we offer mediation for couples, and families going through separation and divorce and things. So, and we're a training organisation, so we train our counsellors who come to us, but we also bring in counsellors who've had external trainings that fit with what our delivery is.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And what do you think are the types of grief and bereavement that people maybe more specifically or experienced to a greater degree during the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think that what's changed is that, grief and loss and bereavement, it's different for everybody. There isn't one way you can say somebody will, there isn't a normal and okay way. There are some things that, overarch. But I think what's probably been different has been the fact that COVID did really rob us, all of the normal process of how we might go through grief. So, for a lot of people, losing people without being there with them, without seeing them, and then not being able to grieve and get together and have a funeral and a celebration of that person's life. I think that really has affected a lot of people. And it doesn't matter, because people died of other things as well as COVID during that time, whatever loss you had. So I think there's a lot of trauma that's probably gone into that as well. And traumatic loss can be more difficult to get over, really. Bereavement's never an easy thing, but sometimes, if it's a natural process and someone's at the end of a long, happy life and they've had a good a death as you feel they can have, that can feel still that loss, but it can feel normal and natural. But I think COVID took people suddenly there was a great shock, and there wasn't that ability to go through the normal process and even afterwards in the grieving.
And do you think that with the UK, there's a notion that it can be harder for us to speak about these sorts of issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are probably getting better, I think, at talking about things. And I mean, something like what we're doing now and having the National Day, it raises the profile. And I think we've all seen people talking on the news and in the media in the last few years. So it's been more so. But yes, I think that what often is there is a fear, isn't it, of upsetting someone. And, you know, any of us who've experienced a loss in our lives will probably have experienced people who are close to us who never mention it to us, you know, and that's quite bizarre. I mean, I think my first great loss was when I was 15 and I was at school. And I remember there were people at school who just didn't speak to me again, you know, and I remember thinking, how weird is that? So I think that fear grips us. And I think as I've grown up, I realise now that if someone doesn't mention it, it doesn't mean they don't care. I think it is that they're not sure what to say. And I would feel the same myself. I mean, I'm a counsellor, I'm used to it, but I recently sent an email to someone who I didn't know that well, who just had a loss. And I found myself thinking, what am I going to type? You know, and I just typed what I was thinking, which was, I don't really know what to say. And I know I can't say anything that will make it any better, but I just wanted to let you know that I was thinking about you at this time. And that person replied to me quite quickly and said, thank you. It really helps to know people are thinking of me. And I think that's something to really bear in mind, that you can't do anything. You can't take away someone's pain, but just knowing that you're being thought about and just knowing there's a listening ear is really helpful to people. So you don't have to say a lot. You don't have to do a lot. You just have to do something, I think.
And that leads nicely onto the next question, which I had, which is, what are some of the best ways or best approaches we can take when speaking to people?
Yeah, I sometimes think whilst I would say on one hand, don't ever assume that someone's experience is the same as your own. So, you know, you've got to always be curious and know there isn't a normal and everyone is different. I also think that it can be quite useful to think, what would I find helpful? And I think anything is really, you know, I mean, it may be depending on how well you know that person and the situation, whether you're going to meet them easily or not. You know, it may be that sending a text or sending a card or sending a letter or, you know, going round to their house and giving them a bunch of flowers or just going round and you know, being there. I think what people often find is if you meet somebody who's suffered a bereavement and you meet them in a public place, say, afterwards, it can be difficult to know. You might be thinking, well, I don't necessarily want to trigger them being upset. So, you know, sometimes in a situation like that, just putting your hand on someone's arm and saying, you know, I've been thinking about you recently, or I'm really sorry to have heard the news, or, you know, just is an acknowledgement, and, you know, you can follow that up afterwards. I mean, I think it's sometimes important to follow your instinct. You know, and sometimes you might think, oh, if I go round, I'm going to intrude. Well, I mean, again, somebody close to me lost a really close person in their family recently. And I just was thinking, gosh, I don't want to intrude because there's a lot of real close family grief here. But I went round and I knocked on the door and I said, I don't want to come in. I just wanted to knock on the door and say, I want to give you a hug and I'm really sorry, you know, and thrust a sort of bunch of flowers and made my retreat, you know, and they did, and afterwards, you know, messaged me and said, oh, it's really lovely that you came round. And I think people do appreciate that. I think they expect at times like that people will intrude on their grief, and they don't necessarily see it as an intrusion. Just read the signals of what you're given, you know, don't barge in and sit down and ask for a cup of tea. So
yeah, I was going to ask, are there certain groups of people that can be harder to speak to? I know there's sometimes ideas of men can be a bit more difficult to open up about certain issues.
Yes, I mean, that can be the case, can't it? I mean, I think, I wonder whether it's a bit about the type of loss that can make it harder sometimes. I mean, if you've got, one of your contemporaries, I'm sort of in my late 50s now and obviously gone through that phase where a lot of us are losing our parents. So, that situation is one situation. But if somebody loses a child, that's quite a different situation, isn't it? And I think it's a bit sometimes about how you might feel quite comfortable with your contemporaries and your peers because you're all going through that loss. But when somebody has a loss that's a bit more not what you expect at that stage of life, that can be harder sometimes to address. So but I think, people will have different ways they deal with it from their family too. And I think something I've often heard in the counselling room, which has really struck me over the years, is people who've talked about losing a parent as a child and no one ever talking to them about it. I've heard many people sort of say, oh, I remember my mum came home and, we got home from school and my grandma was there, and then my mum came home later and someone said my dad had gone to sleep and he wouldn't be coming back, and we never saw him again, and we didn't know what had happened, and we thought going to sleep was, a bit of a scare, and it just seems totally bizarre, and that sometimes no one says anything, and I think that's the worst thing, isn't it?
Do you think that's something that's kind of changing kind of in modern generations? Yeah,
I think so. And I think that, it's much harder to, not that I would see I don't think you should protect a child from the loss of a parent, because it's really sad, but it's happened and you've got to face it and deal with it and try and help them with it. But I think it's a lot harder for us to shield children and young people these days from what's going on in the world, isn't it? We know that they're much more exposed to the media and social media and things. So I think that we're therefore talking about that a lot more, and it's there, and they pick that up at school as well, whether they pick it up at home. So I do think that is changing.
Yeah, and of course we're just in the run up to the National Day of Reflection. So I was wondering, are events like that a good chance to speak to somebody about the grief and bereavement that they've been experiencing?
Yes, I think it probably is. It's often, I think as well, that's about, we're doing that reflecting on what's happened around COVID and the pandemic. But I think it's, any loss that people experience often triggers feelings of other losses they've had. So, it's an opportunity to talk about those things in general. And I think that's the other thing that's important, that, loss doesn't go away. We just learn to live with it in lots of ways. We learn to live with the grief, and the raw pain sometimes, diminishes over time. But it's important to reflect and remember, and even if the loss you had was many years ago, really. I was just thinking when we were talking just then, when I was saying about different experiences of grief, I was thinking also about suicide. I think is another area that people find really hard to talk about or know how to acknowledge when they know someone has lost a loved one through that. I think they often feel that it's really difficult to broach that and what to say.
And with something like that, is that again I heard from somebody the idea of it's better to say something and to try and approach somebody than not to do so at all.
Yeah, I think so. And I think often you might fall back on the line of, I don't know what to say, because, I wish I could say something that would help, because I think that's what we all feel, isn't it? We feel helpless in the face of death because it's one thing we can't control. And so we are helpless because it's something that happens and is a natural part of life. It may not always happen at the natural times we expect it to, but so I think helplessness is what people feel often. And so therefore, often admitting that, that's often, as I say, an important thing to say. I don't know what to say. I know there's nothing I can say. And I think sometimes a lot of the time people don't want to talk too much about the person, I don't want to sort of upset them. But I think, again, it's a great comfort to people to hear stories of the person and other people's stories of them, other people's memories, because we all, have different experiences of someone. And I can remember when my dad died, and my brother and I went to the local newsagents to cancel his newspaper delivery and to pay the bill, and we told the newspaper man behind the counter, who we'd never met before, that he died sadly, and he was in his late 80s, and that we wouldn't. And this chap started talking about, oh, he was such a lovely chap. He used to come in every Saturday and pay the bill, and then he used to always buy a packet of this or whatever. And we walked out, and it was like, gosh, that man, the newsagent and my dad's relationship was a relationship that I never saw him have or had with him. And it was really nice to just hear how he touched someone else's life. And yes, it's emotional, but I think it's really important. So sometimes sharing memories of someone, or saying, gosh, I always remember this about them or that about them, can be a great comfort to people.
Yeah, certainly. And we've got some questions from the community, and anybody who's here, if they want to ask or use the chat function, then please do so. The first one is around loss as it relates to long COVID. So it's a different type of loss in a sense, but it definitely has feelings of grief. We've had people speak to us about others not understanding the loss they experienced due to long COVID, the loss of who they once were. Do you have any advice for how people can convey this?
Yeah, I think, as you say, it's any sort of change that happens is often has a loss in it, and sometimes that change means something new is coming along. But when you have, if you're losing some of your capacity, losing your ability, and you're suffering with long COVID, yes, you've lost a big part of your life, big part of your identity. And as you say, I think people might not see it straight away. So I think that's the thing. It's a sort of, something that's not seen, is it? If they meet you on a Zoom, or they meet you at work, or they see you just out and about. So I think it can be quite difficult. So I think it's probably important, isn't it, for someone to share that, to explain what it's meaning to them, and how they're feeling about it. And for people to acknowledge, as I think I said at the beginning, that, loss covers a lot of things, doesn't it? We that's always the thing, I think, in relationship work. When relationships end, there's a loss. Sometimes there's some gain as people go forward, and they might move into a happier place, or they might move into new relationships, but they've got to go through a loss. There's a huge adjustment with something like long COVID, as with any sort of chronic health condition, really. And I think it can send shockwaves through relationships too, because it changes the dynamics. One person might become a carer, whereas the equality in the relationship, with your loved ones, can change as well, because you suddenly feel that you're not the same people you were. This person isn't the person that you married or chose to be with. This person isn't the same mum or dad that you had before. So I think everyone will experience, the people around you will experience the loss of the person you were, as well as you experiencing the loss of the person you were. So I think it's about acknowledging those things, and sometimes people don't want to sound self-pitying or sound selfish or sound like they're dwelling on something, but just voicing those things can make a lot of difference, really, and start a journey perhaps of how you can make changes, or what you can, where you can glean some positives, or what changes you can see might be made, or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that leads on to something that I was also thinking around, in terms of the fact that for some people, with things opening up and restrictions being loosened, that some people are seeing people for the first time in a couple of years, and in essence they appear like the same person, but actually relationships can be a big thing that's been affected in terms of breakups and people moving on and so on. So are those things that people should look to try and acknowledge as well?
Yes, I think so. And I think we've all changed, haven't we? And there's people's experience of what they want now. Some people have sort of said, oh, great, we're back to normal, that's it. But we're not back to normal. It's a new normal. And I think that even if we move on and we don't go into any restrictions again, and COVID does fade away and become less of a dangerous thing, we've been through an experience. I mean, I certainly think that when it all started, there was that disbelief. Well, this can't really be happening. This is a sort of science fiction movie. Pandemics and people closing down and shops being shut and all of this. And I think for me, I definitely think it's a bit like that thing when you're a child, when you suddenly realize your parents aren't invincible anymore and that they don't absolutely know everything. I suddenly feel like, well, actually, things do happen in the world that are really seem way out and out of what I believe is normal. So I think that for a lot of us, it shifted our feeling, and our fear sounds a very dramatic word, but our feeling that actually things could spiral out of control. And I think a lot of people suffer from that feeling of, what else might happen. So I think there's tentative steps about going back and the change that we all had.
Yeah, and we've just had a message from Peter who says loss is essentially personal, but in the pandemic and with the extent of coverage on TV, etc., COVID-related deaths have become commonplace. Has this reduced or enhanced the empathy of others?
That's an interesting point, isn't it? Because it's almost, yes, I suppose what it's saying there is, does it sort of dilute it? It becomes everybody's saying, oh, well, yes, I know someone who's, oh, yes, I know someone who's, and so it feels less that that your situation is unique at that time or whatever. So yeah, I think it can what's the word, numb us, because we see so much of it. So it becomes we become a bit numb to it, don't we? And we become a bit, oh, that's happened, oh, that's happened. And so I think that it was so much, wasn't it? It was almost overwhelming. There was so much loss at one time. And so that is quite difficult to process. So I think that probably the way we as humans process that in some way is we do shut down a bit and just, sort of become numb to it, really. Yeah.
And I guess there's the kind of non-family aspect to that as well. It makes me think of the workplace and the fact that if people are returning to their office, then they may have experienced grief or bereavement, or people around them, and not really had the chance that they might have had if they've been there at the time to acknowledge and respond to that. Yeah,
that's right. I think there's something about you could meet with a colleague at work, couldn't you, and find out down the line 18 months later that they lost someone close to them, and it feels like, gosh, I didn't know that at the time. And that can be quite hard. But I don't think it's ever sort of too late to acknowledge that, because I think that an important thing is continuing to acknowledge that with people, isn't it? And something that sometimes people say is really helpful is when people remember anniversaries, they remember that it was a year ago that you lost that loved one, or that it was 2 years ago, or that it was 10 years ago. If that will always be a significant date for you, a significant time.
Yeah, and I think that leads on to a question asked by Anne, who says, is there best time to speak to someone? My friend lost their mum from your first lockdown, and I wasn't sure if it's now too late.
I don't think it's ever too late, no, because it will still. And again, that thing about when you've had a loss, and I mean for someone who lost their mother, that will always stay with you, won't it? And there's different stages in life when that might come up, and I mean for that, so I think that's something always to be aware of. If somebody goes to a check, like suddenly somebody's getting married or something and they lost someone, they will remember at that point the person they lost, and it can sometimes be acknowledged at times like that. I'm sure you're really looking forward to your wedding and it's going to be a lovely day, but I guess you will notice the loss of X or Y on that day because they're not going to be there. And I think those little acknowledgements can be quite important. They're the things that people sometimes say, oh, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to upset them on, I wouldn't say that it's the thing you say to the bride just after she's got married, but it's something that you might say to somebody around that time. It's important to acknowledge that. So no, I don't think it's ever too late to say to someone, I'm sorry to hear about that, and ask them how they're coping now. How has it been? How are you feeling? How is it?
And in terms of family dynamic, Nick asked, our family has never really spoken much about our feelings. Are there ways of changing this?
Yeah, it's always tricky, isn't it, because I think we're all governed by how our families are. That's what sort of starts our journey in life and what we consider the normal. And if you come from a family where feelings are talked about and acknowledged and there's a lot of empathy, that's really good. But then if you come from a family, like I said earlier, where they might not even tell you somebody's died, they sort of use euphemisms and pretend this person's just gone off somewhere and, no one actually acknowledges it. And I always think in families as well, the whole issue about do children go to funerals is a big debate and something that families differ on. So, I mean, if you come from a family where things aren't talked about and you want to start that, then I suppose the place to start is by talking about your feelings. And, that might, by you making yourself a bit vulnerable by saying, I want to share how upset I felt about this, or I really wanted to talk about, this or that, then people will, they may start by focusing on your feeling and acknowledging yours, but not want to open up about theirs at first. That might be a longer journey. I suppose what I'm thinking is you can't expect them to suddenly say, oh, I'm really glad you've said that because I really want to talk about my feelings. They might be quite scared by that and think, oh gosh, he's going somewhere here that I don't want to go, and try not to engage too much. But I think it's about gentle prods in that way. And trying other ways. I mean, sometimes people don't want a face-to-face discussion, but sometimes people might have a discussion over email, or they might have a discussion over text, or you might be able to, open up a discussion by just, mentioning something or saying, oh, I saw such and such today, and that reminded me of Grandad, and, sending that in a WhatsApp, and they might respond with, oh gosh, yes, he did used to love, Yorkshire puddings, didn't he? Or whatever it is, just trying to find some connection to get them to sort of talk with you. That may be a way. But I think everybody's sort of experience of grief is different. And there isn't a right or a wrong way. And it's really important to sort of normalize someone's experience. It might not be your experience, but it's their experience.
Yeah, and the final question we have for the moment, unless if anybody else wants to ask anything else, just let us know. But it's from Laura, and it's related to that as well. Is there a best way of knowing how to comfort someone? Often I've wanted to, but didn't want to say something that's clumsy or offensive.
And I think that's it. Think about what would it mean to you if someone said something, and just not, less is more sometimes, really. You don't have to give a great long speech to the person, but just saying, I'm really sorry to, hear of your loss, or, it's lovely to see you today. I know you're going through a difficult time. But I just think, just sometimes it is amazing. I mean, I suppose I find it amazing because it's not how I would be, but it is amazing how people don't say anything. And then people do notice that, I think, and feel hurt and feel that someone hasn't acknowledged it. So I think you're very unlikely to offend somebody. You're more likely to offend them by not saying anything, really, by not acknowledging it. And just a simple, I don't know what to say. What can I say? Because, as we say, there isn't anything you can say. And I think that's the important thing, that you've said something, you've acknowledged that this has happened. And being there, I mean, some people, as we say, some people, that will just be it. It will be a quick exchange, and they might not want to talk. It might be the place you're in at the time, they don't want to. But other people may want to open up and talk to you, and they may want to give you a hug and have a good cry on your shoulder. I think it's, it's letting them know that's okay, and that you're not fazed by that, really.
Oh, thank you so much for joining To end with, it'd be great to find out more about how people can find and access Relate services.
Yes, I mean, Relate, obviously our website, relate.org.uk. On our website as well, one of the services that we have that is quite important is we have a web chat, a 30-minute web chat service, which is something that people sometimes use just to sort of dip their toe in the water, really, and just to start the process and see whether this is for them. But during sort of starting when the pandemic started, we had at that point, some funding, and we were able to offer that for free to certain certain sort of sectors of the NHS. It was geographical, meaning that, and we're still doing that. So there are some areas where people can come along and have a chat, and that was really starting because we were realising that need for people to have someone to talk to, but they didn't necessarily have the time to involve themselves in a series of counselling sessions. So just being able to have a 30-minute chat was useful. But yeah, our website has lots of links to different things as well. And I think things like obviously as well as what we offer at Relate, organisations like Cruise, of course, that specialise in bereavement, their website is really useful as well. But I would also say that it's important to just think also sometimes about the loss cycle, about that there's a normal way that, there's those stages that we go through of denial and anger and despair and bargaining and acceptance and feeling numb or relieved, yearning, they're all feelings that we will experience. And then it's not a linear thing. You're not going to suddenly wake up and go through them all. You're going to feel angry, you're going to feel sad, you're going to feel acceptance, and then you're going to go back to one of those feelings depending on, what's happening in your life. So I think that's really important to bear in mind, that it will get easier, but it won't go completely away because it's part of life, isn't it?